10 horror movies that sound like they should be for kids, but definitely aren't. We've all been there, at the store, trying to find the perfect film for family movie night, one that the adults will enjoy, but is still appropriate for the kids. You think you have found the perfect film. Perhaps it is based on a popular children's fairy tale, or a beloved kid's character, or maybe the character on the front of the box is just that cute. When you get home, though, you realize you have made a huge mistake by traumatizing your children with a terrifying adult horror film. If only you had read the 2-paragraph summary on the back of the box, you might have avoided years of expensive therapy. Of course, given that many of us have a supercomputer resting in our pockets, this occurrence has become far less common. Everything, including reviews and general information, is available online. There are plenty of horror films that sound like they would be perfect for kids. The following 10 movies are some of the best examples of this phenomenon. Just because it sounds or looks like it should be for kids doesn't mean it actually is. Do your research, read the descriptions and reviews, and pick the right film for your family. These movies may waver in quality, but one thing is certain of all of them: your kids should definitely stay far away. The Fear Street Trilogy, 2021. Author R. L. Stine's name has become synonymous with children's literature, while he has begun to branch out into comic books and adult novels. The famous author of Goosebumps will always be remembered for child-friendly thrills. That is why Fear Street makes this list. Originally, the books upon which this trilogy of horror films are based were written by R. L. Stine. The problem, of course, comes from the fact that they were written for an older demographic, landing in the young adult category of most bookstores. More than that, Netflix took some liberties, bumping up the frights, gore, and sexual content to a level most definitely not aimed at children. The trilogy follows Dina Johnson, a high school student in Shadyside. The town has always seemed cursed. While its neighbor found prosperity, Shadyside found the opposite, and for decades, it has been known as the murder capital of the United States. The town has produced several brutal serial killers, and most believe that it all ties back to Sarah Fear, a witch persecuted in 1666. Dina and her friends must figure out the truth of Sarah Fear's curse as a new killer stalks the streets of their town. Mixing the slasher and supernatural subgenres, Fear Street is a great new horror trilogy. Just don't let the author's name lull you into complacency. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, 2019. It has always been a mystery why Alvin Schwartz short story collections, titled Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, are considered children's books. While the content is generally kid-friendly in terms of gore and sexuality, the stories are scarier than anything else in the bookstore's kids section, especially when paired with the horrifying illustrations of Stephen Gammell and Brett Hellquist. Nevertheless, in the kids section it stays, which probably led to a lot of confusion when parents bought the 2019 film Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which adapted several of the short stories, and discovered it was far more adult than they expected. The story of the film sees several of the stories within the books come to life thanks to a supposed witch's curse. In a startling act of revenge for the wrongs done to her, Sarah Bellows used a book of stories to enact curses against the wrongdoers. When 5 teenagers are trapped in the Bellows home by a bully, they stumble upon Sarah Bellows' book. For each person who trespassed in Sarah's home, a new story appears, each with a horrifying end for the hapless teenagers. They have to band together and discover the truth behind Sarah's supposed death so that they can escape her supernatural wrath. The Banana Splits Movie, 2019. Admittedly, the Banana Splits movie was the inspiration for this entire list. The original Banana Splits television show was a kids' variety show produced by Hanna-Barbera that ran from 1968 to 1970. The show featured 4 animal hosts that played in a rock band and went on wacky adventures. While certain kids may have found the characters creepy, the show was good-spirited. Imagine the surprise of all the adults who grew up with the TV show when they announced a Banana Splits film set to release in 2019, especially when they showed it to their children, only to discover it had transformed into a violent, comedic gore fest. The Banana Splits movie is a horror movie, through and through, taking inspiration from video game sensation Five Nights at Freddy's and the general creepiness of costumed mascots. The premise is pretty simple. The Banana Splits are a group of animatronics on the set of their beloved show, but due to poor ratings, the show has been cancelled. During the announcement, the software in the animatronics malfunctions, sending the beloved characters on a killing spree. It's the Terminator meets Chuck E. Cheese. Given that the Banana Splits once teamed up with the Suicide Squad in the pages of DC Comics, this isn't that bizarre. Gretel and Hansel, 2020. Many people forget that the fairy tales that we know today are heavily edited from their original versions. Most only know the Disney-fied versions, but the original Aesop's fables, Grimm fairy tales, and other classic folk tales were incredibly dark and twisted. Many recent filmmakers have leaned into this concept, focusing heavily on the more haunting themes of these classic stories. Given the other more kid-friendly representations of these tales, though, many should be forgiven for mistakenly picking up a movie like Gretel and Hansel for their kids, only to realize that it isn't nearly as lighthearted as some interpretations of the source material. Gretel and Hansel is a strange twist on the source material. Hansel and Gretel's father has passed, and their mother insists that they find work to support her, turning down several jobs. The children eventually find themselves at the home of an old woman named Hulda. She offers the pair room and board if they agree to work for her. Hulda sees something in Gretel, a latent gift for magic, but Gretel is torn by nightmarish visions. While Hansel goes to work, Hulda teaches Gretel spells, until Hulda's secrets come to light. While it might have the structure of the original fairy tale, Gretel and Hansel takes a dark turn, and is an incredibly underrated horror movie. The Mean One, 2022. Dr. Seuss' How the Grinch Stole Christmas has been an icon of Christmas since the release of the book in 1957. There have been 5 official adaptations of the story, including a live-action film starring Jim Carrey. With that, you'd be forgiven for thinking The Mean One was just another innocent adaptation of the popular story. While the physical case clearly showcases the film's parody horror roots, streaming is a different story, and a quick glance may allow you to overlook the bloody terror. Just when you think you're turning on a wholesome Christmas movie, you have terrorized your family with the scariest live-action adaptation of the character. Due to licensing issues, The Mean One is clearly labeled as a parody horror, with the name, The Grinch, never mentioned in the film. The movie has several other clever, or less than clever, name changes, like the town of Newville and Cindy You Know Who. After witnessing her mother brutally murdered by a green-skinned monster in a Santa suit, Cindy and her father left Newville when she was a child. 20 years later, Cindy's therapist suggests she return to the town to help overcome the trauma of the ordeal, but she discovers that the Mean One has begun a brand new killing spree. Red Riding Hood, 2011. Little Red Riding Hood is one of the most popular fairy tales for young children. Several versions of the folktale have existed throughout Europe, but the most popular come from Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. The story follows a young girl called Red Riding Hood, inspired by the color of her cloak, as she ventures through the woods to her grandmother's house. On the journey, she runs into a wolf, who races ahead of her, eats her grandmother, then disguises himself as the grandmother in an attempt to eat the little girl. In some versions of the tale, the girl dies, while in others, she is saved by a passing hunter. In 2011, director Catherine Hardwicke decided to lean into the darker elements of the story, while also throwing in a twist of supernatural romance, made popular by the Twilight series at the time. The result is Red Riding Hood, starring Amanda Seyfried as Valerie, the titular lead. In this incredibly loose adaptation of the source material, Valerie lives in the village of Daggerhorn with her family. A werewolf hunts in the woods outside the town, but a pact with it has kept them safe for years. The Hug, 2018. There has always been something expressly creepy about animatronics. Perhaps it's their lifeless eyes, stilted movements, or crackly, stereo-fed voices, but no matter the reasons why, animatronic characters have been nightmares for many children. Several horror film and video game developers have leaned into this inherent creepiness with their stories, creating popular horror franchises like Five Nights at Freddy's. The problem for well-meaning parents is that these characters don't look any different from the friendly machines at theme parks and restaurants, meaning they can stumble into an awkward, terrifying situation for their kids. This is the case for the short, Hulu-produced film The Hug. Clocking in at only 5 minutes, it is by far the shortest film on this list, leaning heavily into its oppressively cheerful atmosphere. The story takes place during lead character Adam's birthday party. His parents have brought him to a run-down pizza restaurant, where even the animatronic panda is out of order. Enamored with the creature, Aiden gives it a hug, only to discover that it isn't so innocent. The film is campy and silly, relying intensely on its single scare, but it's terrifying enough despite this to avoid showing it to your kids. Trick or Treat, 2007. Given that Trick or Treat is one of the most popular horror movies, it might be surprising to see it here on this list. While it may be a bit of a stretch, the film definitely doesn't seem that terrifying at first glance. The cover art consistently shows a child named Sam in a Halloween costume with other costumed children, nothing particularly terrifying. Even the premise, a group of kids telling scary stories about the famous local legend, doesn't seem that far removed from Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps, to shows specifically aimed at a younger generation. Despite all of that, though, Trick or Treat is definitely one of the creepiest horror movies on this list. Sam is an incredibly well-designed character, especially when that sack mask comes off, and the focus on the anthology element keeps the story fresh from start to finish. That said, this is clearly an adult horror film, rated R for violence, nudity, and violence. After all, with a serial killing principle, horrifying pranks, and supernatural demon children, the film is equal parts terrifying and hilarious, full of some of the bloodiest and goriest kills in the genre. Jack Frost, 1997. Jack Frost makes this list as a victim of its release date. The indie horror film released in November 1997. 1 year later, in December of 1998, Michael Keaton starred in Jack Frost, a wholesome family Christmas movie about a man who dies in a car crash and is reincarnated into a snowman. The two films are strikingly different, but the fact that they shared a similar release date, a similar premise, and identical names led to some issues for parents and kids, especially since the horror film was released directly to television. Jack Frost follows the post-mortem exploits of the titular character, a former serial killer whose prison transport crashes into a chemical truck. The killer is dissolved by the chemical, melding with the snow. Returning to the world as a living snowman, Jack Frost seeks his revenge against the police and townsfolk of Snow Mountain. His killing spree is bloody, messy, and ridiculous, with plenty of Christmas puns and silly deaths from start to finish. However, silly doesn't mean kid-friendly, and this dark comedy is perfect proof of that fact. Cooties, 2014. It's very rare that children are the villains of a horror movie, but such is the case with Cooties. In this film, a mutated virus has made its way into a batch of chicken nuggets, and any child who eats one becomes a ravenous member of the undead. As an entire playground is overcome by the zombie plague and teachers are killed, the remaining teachers must find a way to survive despite the horde outside their door. One surviving student, Calvin, gives the film its name by claiming that the zombie infection must come from the passing of cooties from one student to another. Cooties is more comedy than horror, so showing it to children is likely not going to traumatize them. That said, this isn't a kid-friendly movie, featuring plenty of instances of blood and violence, as well as some incredibly mature humor. Don't let the name fool you. The title is about as innocent as this film gets. However, given the large cast of children and the more than silly premise, a lot of parents might overlook the rating for what could be a hilarious film for their
Row 18, plot 20.